The bustling Los Angeles International Airport was experiencing one of its typically hectic Monday mornings. Through the premium terminal walkway, Michael Preston strode with an air of self-importance, his designer briefcase swinging with each step. At 42, he had become one of Silicon Valley's most arrogant success stories, having sold his tech startup for millions just 2 years prior. The first-class lounge was his regular haunt, and today was no different. As he sat there sipping an overpriced espresso, an announcement echoed through the speakers. Flight AA-147 to New York JFK has been delayed by 30 minutes. Michael's face twisted in annoyance as he aggressively tapped at his phone screen, firing off angry emails to his assistant about the inconvenience. When boarding finally began, Michael was among the first to walk through the jet bridge, his platinum frequent flyer status ensuring he would be among the earliest to settle into the premium cabin. The first-class section of the Boeing 787 was exactly as he preferred it, nearly empty, with just a few scattered passengers finding their seats. Reaching his assigned seat, 2A, Michael efficiently stored his briefcase in the overhead compartment and settled into the plush leather seat. He immediately began arranging his space, placing his latest model iPhone and tablet on the wide armrest, marking his territory like a creature of habit. It was then that he noticed an elderly man slowly making his way down the aisle. The man wore simple clothing, a weathered leather jacket, plain khaki pants, and comfortable walking shoes. His silver hair was neatly combed, and despite his advanced age, he carried himself with a quiet dignity that some might have found remarkable if they had bothered to notice. Michael watched with growing irritation as the elderly man checked his boarding pass and began to slow near his row. "Please, not next to me," Michael muttered under his breath, but fate had other plans. The man was indeed assigned to 2B, the seat directly beside Michael's. The elderly gentleman carefully stored a modest carry-on bag in the overhead bin and eased himself into his seat. He offered a polite nod to Michael, who responded with barely concealed disdain, immediately returning his attention to his phone. As other passengers continued boarding, Michael's frustration grew. The flight delay had already soured his mood, and now he was stuck next to someone who, in his prejudiced mind, didn't fit his idea of a first-class passenger. He began speaking loudly into his phone, making sure everyone around could hear about his important business dealings and influential connections. "Yeah, can you believe they delayed the flight?" he practically shouted into his phone. "And now I'm stuck here with—" He paused, throwing a dismissive glance at his seatmate. "Well, let's just say the standards aren't what they used to be in first class." The elderly man seemed unfazed by these remarks, calmly reading through the safety card and airline magazine. His composure only served to irritate Michael further, who continued his loud phone conversation, dropping names of famous people he claimed to know and boasting about his recent business successes. A few other first-class passengers began to take notice of Michael's behavior. A well-dressed woman across the aisle shot him a disapproving look, while a business executive 2 rows ahead turned around with a frown. The elderly man, however, maintained his dignity, occasionally glancing out the window as the ground crew prepared the aircraft for departure. As the flight attendants began their pre-flight checks, one of them, Sarah, approached their row. She was about to ask Michael to end his phone call when she caught sight of his elderly seatmate. Her eyes widened slightly, but she maintained her professional composure. "Sir," she addressed Michael, "we're preparing for departure. Please switch your phone to airplane mode." Michael made a show of sighing dramatically before complying, but not before making one final loud comment about how some people were bringing down the standards of premium travel. The elderly man simply adjusted his seatbelt, his weathered hands moving with practiced ease, while a knowing smile played at the corners of his mouth. Little did Michael Preston know, but his behavior over the next few hours would lead to one of the most embarrassing moments of his life, and a lesson in humility he would never forget. The flight to New York was about to become much more than just another business trip. It was about to become a story he would remember for the rest of his life. As the aircraft reached cruising altitude, Michael Preston's behavior only grew worse. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft blue glow, creating a peaceful atmosphere that he seemed determined to disrupt. He pulled out his tablet, deliberately elbowing his elderly seatmate's arm in the process, and began watching a video without headphones. The elderly man in 2B shifted slightly to avoid contact, but remained remarkably composed. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a pair of reading glasses, then retrieved a worn paperback book from his small carry-on bag. The cover was folded back, making the title impossible to read. Michael's phone buzzed with an incoming message, and despite the flight attendant's earlier warning, he immediately began another loud conversation. "Listen, Jerry, these contracts need to be signed today. I don't care if you have to wake up half of Tokyo." His voice carried through the entire first-class cabin, causing several passengers to stir uncomfortably in their seats. Sarah, the flight attendant who had noticed something special about the elderly passenger earlier, approached their row again. "Sir, I need to remind you that phone calls aren't permitted during flight," she said firmly but politely. Michael waved her off dismissively. "Just give me a minute. This is important business." He turned slightly away from her, continuing his conversation as if she weren't there. The elderly man glanced up from his book, making brief eye contact with Sarah. She gave him an apologetic look, and he responded with a subtle shake of his head, as if to say it wasn't necessary to make a fuss. But Michael wasn't done. After reluctantly ending his call, he turned to the elderly man with a sneer. "You know, there was a time when first class meant something, when it was exclusive." He looked pointedly at his seatmate's simple clothing. "Now they let just anyone up here if they can scrape together enough miles." A few nearby passengers gasped at the rudeness of his comment. The elderly man slowly closed his book and turned to face Michael. His movement had a deliberate quality to it, reminiscent of scenes from countless Western films, though Michael was too self-absorbed to notice the parallel. "Son," the elderly man spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a gravelly but controlled tone, "your mother ever teach you about respect?" Michael scoffed. "Respect? Please. What are you going to do? Go all Clint Eastwood on me? Make my day?" He laughed at his own joke, looking around as if expecting others to join in. Nobody did. The elderly man's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes, a mixture of amusement and what might have been pity. He said nothing, simply returning to his book. A businessman across the aisle had been watching the exchange with growing interest. He pulled out his phone and began typing something, occasionally glancing at the elderly man with an expression of dawning recognition. Michael, oblivious to the shifting atmosphere in the cabin, continued his tirade. "You know what's wrong with this country? Everyone thinks they deserve first-class treatment. Back in the day, people knew their place." Sarah returned with another flight attendant, both looking concerned. The second attendant, whose name tag read David, leaned down and whispered something to his colleague. Sarah's eyes widened, and she quickly composed herself. "Mr. Preston," she said, using his name for the first time, "I need to speak with you privately." She gestured toward the galley area. "Whatever you have to say, you can say it here," Michael replied loudly. "I know my rights as a first-class passenger." The elderly man shifted in his seat, and for a brief moment, his jacket fell open, revealing a familiar Directors Guild pin on his lapel. A young woman in the row behind them noticed it and let out a small gasp of recognition. The tension in the first-class cabin was building to a breaking point. Michael remained completely unaware that his rude behavior and dismissive attitude toward his seatmate were about to backfire in a way he could never have anticipated. The next few moments would teach him a lesson about judging others that he would never forget. The situation in first class reached its tipping point when Michael pulled out his lunch, a strongly scented tuna sandwich from the airport deli. He unwrapped it noisily, dropping pieces of lettuce on the shared armrest between him and his elderly seatmate. When the older man carefully moved the fallen pieces onto Michael's tray, Michael rolled his eyes dramatically. "Got a problem with my lunch, old-timer?" Michael asked, deliberately taking an oversized bite and talking with his mouth full. "I suppose you're used to TV dinners and early bird specials." The elderly man slowly removed his reading glasses and placed them in his jacket pocket. His movements were measured, almost rehearsed, like someone who had performed similar actions countless times before cameras. "Actually," he said in that gravelly voice, "I prefer a good steak, medium rare." Several passengers who had been watching the ongoing drama leaned forward in their seats. There was something eerily familiar about the way the elderly man delivered that simple line about steak. A businessman in row 4 was now frantically typing on his phone, occasionally looking up with an expression of growing excitement. "Well, we can't all afford steak in our golden years," Michael sneered, missing the significance of the moment entirely. Maybe you should have planned better for retirement instead of splurging on first-class tickets. Sarah, the flight attendant, appeared again at their row. Her face showed a mixture of concern and something else, respect, but not directed at Michael. "Sir," she said to the elderly man, "can I get you anything? Perhaps some water or—" Michael cut her off. "Hey, I'm the one being bothered here. This guy keeps giving me attitude, trying to act all tough like he's Clint Eastwood or something." He laughed at his own joke again, spraying breadcrumbs across his tray table. The elderly man turned slowly in his seat, fixing Michael with a steady gaze that had made countless Hollywood villains tremble over the decades. The cabin seemed to grow quieter, as if the very air was holding its breath. "You seem very focused on Clint Eastwood," the elderly man said, his voice carrying that distinctive combination of gravel and steel that had delivered some of cinema's most memorable lines. "Any particular reason?" Before Michael could respond, the businessman who had been typing on his phone suddenly stood up. "Oh my God," he said, loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "You're actually him. You're Clint Eastwood." Michael's sandwich stopped halfway to his mouth. A piece of tuna fell unnoticed onto his expensive trousers. His face, which had been red with self-righteous anger just moments before, began to pale dramatically. The elderly man, Clint Eastwood himself, gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to the businessman, then returned his attention to Michael. He didn't speak, didn't need to. Decades of commanding the silver screen had taught him the power of silence. Sarah stepped forward again, this time with unmistakable authority. "Mr. Eastwood, I apologize for any disturbance. Mr. Preston, I need to speak with you immediately." Her tone left no room for argument. Other passengers were now openly staring, several holding up phones, trying to discreetly capture the moment. Michael sat frozen, his sandwich forgotten, as the realization of what he had done, who he had been insulting, crashed over him in waves. I didn't," Michael stammered, his earlier arrogance evaporating like morning dew under a harsh sun. Eastwood raised a hand, stopping Michael's attempted explanation. "You know what the problem is with making assumptions, kid?" he asked, his voice carrying that familiar mixture of wisdom and warning that had captivated audiences for generations. The entire first-class cabin waited for the response, but Eastwood simply picked up his book again, leaving Michael to stew in the crushing weight of his own embarrassment. The message was clear. Some lessons need to be learned through silence rather than words. Sarah gestured for Michael to follow her to the galley, and for the first time since boarding, he complied without argument. As he stood on shaky legs, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the darkened window. The face looking back at him was that of a man who had just learned the hard way that appearances can be deceiving, and respect isn't something you demand, it's something you earn. In the galley area, Sarah spoke quietly but firmly to Michael, explaining that his behavior was unacceptable, particularly toward one of Hollywood's most respected legends. Michael stood there, his expensive shoes suddenly fascinating to him, as the reality of his situation continued to sink in. Back in the cabin, word of Clint Eastwood's presence had spread like wildfire. Passengers from business class found excuses to walk past, pretending to head to the bathroom while stealing glances at the legendary actor. The first-class cabin, usually a haven of quiet luxury, buzzed with excited whispers. "Did you see those Western films he directed?" One passenger whispered to another. "My father loved Dirty Harry," another added softly. "Didn't he win Oscars for Unforgiven and $1 Million Baby?" Mr. Eastwood remained seemingly oblivious to the attention, calmly reading his book. His dignified response to Michael's earlier behavior had only enhanced his legendary status among the watching passengers. When Michael finally returned to his seat, his entire demeanor had changed. Gone was the arrogant tech executive who had boarded the plane. In his place sat a humbled man who could barely look at his seatmate. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to clean up his forgotten sandwich. A young flight attendant named Jenny approached their row with a fresh cup of coffee. "Here's your regular order, Mr. Eastwood," she said warmly. "Black, no sugar. Just the way you like it during flights." Michael's head snapped up. Not only was he sitting next to Clint Eastwood, but the crew knew him well enough to remember his coffee preference. The implications of his earlier behavior became even more mortifying. The businessman who had first recognized Eastwood caught Michael's eye and shook his head disapprovingly. Mr. Eastwood has been flying this route to visit his family for years, he explained loud enough for others to hear. He's known for being one of the most courteous passengers in first class. Michael wanted to disappear into his seat. Each new revelation made his previous behavior seem more inexcusable. He remembered with horror his mocking impression of "Make My Day," one of cinema's most iconic lines, performed mockingly in front of the very man who made it famous. Sarah returned with a tablet in hand. "Mr. Eastwood," she said respectfully, "the captain wanted me to remind you that you're always welcome to visit the cockpit during the flight. He's a huge fan of Sully and would love to thank you for bringing Captain Sullenberger's story to the screen." Eastwood nodded graciously. "Maybe later," he replied in that distinctive voice. "Don't want to disturb his work." Even this simple exchange demonstrated the contrast between his humble professionalism and Michael's earlier attention-seeking behavior. A mother from business class approached their row, holding her sleeping baby. "Mr. Eastwood," she whispered, "I just wanted to say, my grandmother worked as an extra on The Outlaw Josie Wales. She always said you were the kindest director she ever met." Eastwood gave her a warm smile and asked about her grandmother, showing genuine interest. Michael watched this interaction, remembering with growing shame how he had mocked the actor's age and appearance. The revelation of his seatmate's identity had transformed the flight into something surreal for Michael. Every few minutes, another passenger would walk by, each with their own story about how Eastwood's films or directing had touched their lives. The actor handled each interaction with grace and humility, qualities that made Michael's earlier behavior seem even more appalling. As the reality of the situation fully settled in, Michael realized he wasn't just sitting next to a famous actor. He was sitting next to a living legend, a man who had shaped American cinema for over half a century, and he had treated him like an unwanted intrusion in his precious first-class space. The next few hours stretched ahead of Michael like an eternity. He needed to find a way to apologize, but how does one apologize for insulting Clint Eastwood to his face? The answer to that question would require more courage than Michael had ever needed in his life, and he wasn't sure he had it in him. The next hour of the flight felt like the longest in Michael Preston's life. Every few minutes, he would glance sideways at the legendary actor beside him, then quickly look away when the shame became too much to bear. His earlier bravado had completely vanished, replaced by a gnawing sense of regret that seemed to grow with each passing minute. Mr. Eastwood had returned to his book, occasionally making small notes in the margins with a well-worn pencil. Michael noticed that it was actually a screenplay, though he couldn't make out the title. The simple act of watching Eastwood work made Michael realize he was witnessing something few people ever got to see, a master craftsman quietly perfecting his art at 30,000 feet. Word of Eastwood's presence had spread throughout the entire aircraft. The curtain separating first class from business class was now constantly in motion as passengers found creative excuses to peek through. Flight attendants from other sections of the plane kept finding reasons to pass through first class, each trying to catch a glimpse of the Hollywood legend. A young boy, no more than 10 years old, bravely approached their row with his father close behind. "Excuse me, Mr. Eastwood," the father said softly. "My son Tommy here is doing a school project on American cinema, and well..." Eastwood set his screenplay aside and gave the boy his full attention. "What would you like to know, partner?" he asked, his gravely voice carrying a warmth that made Tommy's face light up. Michael watched in silence as Eastwood spent several minutes discussing filmmaking with the child, explaining complex concepts in simple terms that Tommy could understand. He spoke about the importance of storytelling, the value of hard work, and the need to always respect your crew, lessons that made Michael sink further into his seat as he remembered his own disrespectful behavior. Sarah appeared again with fresh coffee for both men, though Michael barely touched his. She handed Eastwood a note from the captain, who had apparently been a Marine before becoming a pilot. Eastwood read it with interest and asked Sarah to thank the captain for his service. "You served too, didn't you, sir?" Sarah asked, though she clearly knew the answer. "Army, swimming instructor at Fort Ord," Eastwood replied modestly, not mentioning his later fame or success. This humble response from someone who had achieved so much made Michael's earlier boasting about his tech company seem even more foolish. As the flight progressed, Michael noticed something remarkable. Despite the constant stream of admirers and well-wishers, Eastwood treated each person with the same quiet respect, from the star-struck flight attendants to the elderly passenger who just wanted to thank him for making Gran Torino. It was a masterclass in grace and humility that made Michael question everything about his own behavior, not just on this flight but in his daily life. A flight attendant from economy class, who had finally found an excuse to visit first class, was nearly in tears as she told Eastwood how $1 Million Baby had inspired her to pursue boxing as a hobby. Instead of dismissing her or giving a cursory response, he asked thoughtful questions about her training and offered genuine encouragement. Michael's phone lay forgotten in his pocket. His important business calls and emails suddenly seemed trivial compared to the real human connections he was witnessing. He watched as Eastwood turned down offers for special treatment, insisted on being called Clint rather than Mr. Eastwood, and genuinely listened when people spoke to him. The contrast between Eastwood's behavior and his own couldn't have been starker. Here was a man who had every right to demand special treatment, yet he asked for none. A man who had achieved more than Michael could ever dream of, yet carried himself with humility and grace. As the flight reached its midpoint, Michael realized he was watching a masterclass in how to treat others. Every interaction Eastwood had with the crew and passengers was a reminder of how badly he had behaved earlier. The aftermath of his revelation wasn't just about sitting next to a famous actor. It was about witnessing true class and dignity in action and recognizing how far he had to go to become a better person. As the flight continued eastward, Michael found himself learning more from Clint Eastwood's silence than he had from any business seminar or leadership workshop. The legendary actor had returned to his screenplay, but every so often, you would pause to help a flight attendant with a heavy serving tray or offer his blanket to an elderly passenger who seemed cold. Michael watched as Sarah approached their row again, this time looking concerned. "Mr. Eastwood," she said quietly, "we have a passenger in economy who's feeling anxious about flying. When she heard you were on board, she mentioned how your films helped her through tough times. Would you mind if—" Before she could finish, Eastwood was already standing. "Lead the way," he said simply. Michael observed as the actor followed Sarah to economy class, where he spent 20 minutes talking quietly with a nervous passenger, completely unconcerned about crossing the invisible barriers between cabin classes that Michael had been so eager to enforce earlier. When Eastwood returned, a businessman across the aisle spoke up. "Sir, I've followed your career since I was a kid. The thing that always impressed me most wasn't just your acting or directing. It was how you treated your film crews. My uncle worked as a gaffer on Mystic River, and he said you knew everyone's name on set." Eastwood nodded thoughtfully. "A film's only as good as the people behind the scenes," he replied. "Same goes for life." His eyes briefly met Michael's as he said this, the message clear but unspoken. Michael remembered all the times he berated his own staff, the assistants he'd made cry, the service workers he treated as beneath him. Each memory now felt like a weight in his stomach. A flight attendant named David approached with a tablet, showing Eastwood some photos of his grandfather who had been an extra in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Instead of dismissing the young man, Eastwood spent several minutes sharing stories about filming in Spain, treating David's family connection to his past work with genuine respect. "My grandfather said those were the best 3 weeks of his life," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "He only had a small background role, but you treated him like he mattered." "Everyone matters," Eastwood replied simply. "Too many people forget that." Michael shifted uncomfortably in his seat, knowing he had been one of those people who forgot. He thought about his behavior at restaurants, at hotels, on previous flights. How many people had he made feel small just to make himself feel important? The lesson continued as Eastwood handled a small issue with his meal. His ordered steak had come well done instead of medium rare, but rather than complain, he simply thanked the crew and ate what he was served. Michael, who had sent back countless meals for minor imperfections, felt another wave of shame wash over him. As the flight progressed, Michael noticed more subtle things about his seatmate. How Eastwood would gather any trash around his area to save the flight attendant's work. How he never interrupted anyone, no matter how long their story took to tell. How he seemed to really listen when people spoke, giving them his full attention instead of just waiting for his turn to talk. The real education came when a young aspiring filmmaker approached their row, nervously clutching a notebook. Instead of brushing him off, Eastwood spent time sharing practical advice about storytelling and the importance of persistence. "You know what makes a good director?" he asked the young man. someone who remembers they're part of a team, not above it. Michael found himself taking mental notes, not about filmmaking, but about human dignity. Every interaction he witnessed was a lesson in how to treat others with respect, regardless of their status or position. The man beside him had won multiple Academy Awards, directed countless classics, and become an American icon, yet he carried himself with more humility than Michael had shown as a simple tech executive. The irony wasn't lost on Michael that he had spent the first part of the flight trying to prove he belonged in first class, while Eastwood, who had every right to act superior, treated everyone as his equal. It was becoming clear that true class had nothing to do with which cabin you sat in, and everything to do with how you treated others. As the captain announced their initial descent into New York, Michael Preston realized he was running out of time. For the past several hours, he had been struggling with how to apologize to Clint Eastwood. The words he normally used to close business deals or charm investors seemed hollow and inadequate for this situation. The seatbelt sign dinged on, and Eastwood carefully marked his place in the screenplay he'd been reading. Michael noticed his hands were shaking slightly as he gathered his courage. It was now or never. "Mr. Eastwood," Michael began, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know where to start." The legendary actor turned to face him, his expression neutral but not unkind. Those famous eyes, which had captivated audiences for decades, focused on Michael with an intensity that made him understand why so many movie villains had quaked under the same gaze. "Earlier, my behavior was—" Michael paused, searching for the right words. "It was inexcusable. I treated you with disrespect before I knew who you were, which makes it even worse because it shows I'm the kind of person who judges people based on, well, nothing that matters." Eastwood remained silent, listening. His silence somehow made it both easier and harder for Michael to continue. "I've spent the last few hours watching how you treat everyone around you, the flight attendants, the other passengers, even that nervous flyer in economy class. And I realize that I'm everything that's wrong with people like me. People who think money or success gives them the right to look down on others." A flight attendant passed by, collecting trash before landing. Eastwood handed her his empty coffee cup with a kind smile, then returned his attention to Michael. "The truth is," Michael continued, his voice growing stronger as he faced his own failures, "I've been so focused on proving I belong in first class that I forgot how to be a first-class human being. Watching you today, it's been like seeing everything I've done wrong in my life reflected back at me." The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, and both men gripped their armrests. When the aircraft steadied, Michael pressed on, knowing this might be his only chance. "My mother would be ashamed of how I acted today. She raised me better than this. She used to say that character is who you are when nobody's watching, and my character today, well, it showed exactly who I've become. Some I don't want to be anymore." For the first time since Michael began speaking, Eastwood shifted in his seat, turning to face him more directly. His expression remained unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, not judgment, but perhaps understanding. "I know an apology doesn't fix anything," Michael said, his voice cracking slightly. "And I know I can't take back what I said or how I acted. But I want you to know that this flight, meeting you, it's changed something in me, or maybe it's woken up something I forgot was there." The plane began its descent into JFK, the Manhattan skyline visible through the windows. Michael took a deep breath and finished what he needed to say. "I'm not just sorry for how I treated you, Mr. Eastwood. I'm sorry for how I've treated everyone who I thought was beneath me. Watching you today showed me what real class looks like, and it has nothing to do with which section of the plane you're sitting in." As Michael finished speaking, the cabin fell into silence except for the hum of the engines. He waited, heart pounding, for any response from the man beside him, the same man he had mocked and belittled hours earlier, not knowing he was insulting an American icon. Eastwood was quiet for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, deliberately, he turned to Michael. The wisdom of decades seemed to reflect in his eyes as he considered his response. Whatever he was about to say, Michael knew it would stay with him for the rest of his life. The plane continued its descent into New York, carrying two men who had started the flight as strangers. One a legend of cinema, the other a man on the verge of learning the most important lesson of his life. As the plane touched down at JFK International Airport, Clint Eastwood finally broke his silence. "You know, he said in that distinctive gravelly voice. It takes a different kind of courage to admit when you're wrong. Most people just double down on their mistakes. Michael sat perfectly still, absorbing every word as Eastwood continued. I've been in this business for over 60 years. You know what I've learned? The grips, the camera operators, the assistants. They're the ones who really make the magic happen. Same goes for these flight attendants, the ground crew, everyone who keeps us safe up here. Success isn't about rising above others. It's about lifting them up with you. The aircraft taxied to its gate, and passengers began gathering their belongings. Michael noticed an elderly woman in the row behind struggling with her heavy carry-on bag. Without hesitation, he stood up and helped her, earning a nod of approval from Eastwood. That's a start, Eastwood said quietly. As they prepared to disembark Sarah, the flight attendant who had witnessed the entire journey of Michael's transformation approached their row one last time. Mr. Eastwood, thank you for flying with us today. And Mr. Preston, she paused, noting the genuine change in his demeanor. Have a good day in New York. Walking through the terminal, Michael found himself holding doors open for others, helping a mother with her stroller, and actually seeing the people around him for perhaps the first time in years. Each small act of kindness felt like a step toward redemption. Near the baggage claim, a group of fans had somehow learned of Eastwood's arrival. They gathered respectfully, keeping their distance but clearly excited. Michael watched in amazement as Eastwood took time to greet each one, showing the same courtesy to the starstruck teenagers as he did to the distinguished-looking business executives. Before they parted ways, Eastwood turned to Michael one last time. Remember something, kid, he said, using the same term he'd used with countless actors over the years. Life's not about how much money you make or what cabin you sit in. It's about how you treat the person who serves your coffee or carries your bags. That's what shows who you really are. Michael nodded, understanding that he had been given not just a lesson, but a chance to change. Thank you, Mr. Eastwood. Not just for the words, but for showing me what I needed to see. Call me Clint, Eastwood replied with a slight smile, and do me a favor, pass it on. Someone else might need the same wake-up call you got today. As Eastwood walked away, surrounded by his small security detail, Michael pulled out his phone. Instead of checking his emails or stock prices, he opened his contacts and scrolled to his assistant's name, the same assistant he had berated earlier about the flight delay. Janet, it's Michael Preston. Listen, I need to apologize for my behavior this morning. Actually, for my behavior over the past 2 years. His voice cracked slightly as he began making amends. Over the next few weeks, Michael's colleagues and employees noticed a dramatic change in him. The arrogant tech executive who had boarded that flight to New York seemed to have vanished. In his place was a leader who learned people's names, who listened more than he spoke, who found ways to lift others up instead of putting them down. 6 months later, on another first-class flight, Michael found himself sitting next to a young executive who was berating a flight attendant about the wine selection. He thought about Clint Eastwood and smiled. You know, Michael said to the young man, I learned something interesting about success on a flight like this. Would you like to hear about it? The young executive turned, ready to dismiss him, but something in Michael's voice made him pause and listen. And so the lesson continued, passed on from one person to another, just as Eastwood had suggested. As Michael began sharing his story, he glanced out the window at the clouds below. Somewhere out there, he knew, Clint Eastwood was probably on another flight, quietly teaching the same lessons about dignity, respect, and what it truly means to be first class, not by his words, but by his actions. And that, Michael had learned, was the most powerful lesson of all.